The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Canada has one of the highest COVID-19 vaccination rates in the world. It makes for a stark contrast to many other, mostly lower-income countries. Tonight, how to make up that ground in pursuit of vaccine equity. Then, from our Ontario hubs, what's inspiring Black women to run for elected office. And from reclaiming populism to whether the wellness industry has a racism problem, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, February 25th, and that's ahead on the agenda. More than 60% of the world's population has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. And while that's good, it leaves many, many around the world unprotected. A lot of those people are in the global south. With us on efforts to increase global vaccine equity in Whitehorse, Yukon, Dr. Catherine Smart, president of the Canadian Medical Association. In Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Stuart Hickox, Canada Director for the Global Advocacy Campaign, ONE. And in Ontario's capital city, Rowena Pinto, Chief Program Officer for UNICEF Canada. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Hi.
Good to be here.
Thank
you. Stuart, I'll start with you. Why has the ONE campaign taken up the cause of vaccine equity?
Our mission is to end extreme poverty and preventable disease, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So COVID response is right in the crosshairs of our work and has been our focus for the past couple of years. There's a giant gap between the global north and global south on so many issues. And once again, when it comes to vaccines and ending the pandemic, we've seen that stark inequality laid bare in front of us again. So it's the focus of our work right now.
Do you think that the pandemic has exacerbated those issues?
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic, we're talking about the need to get everyone vaccinated, but our work is going to continue for years and years because there's been such we're calling knock-on effects on other global health and security issues, nutrition, girls' education, the fight against HIV, TB, and malaria. All of these issues have been set back by the focus on the pandemic. And, our approach to this has been there needs to be an equal approach to vaccines, access, tests, and treatments. Doing that properly would actually create infrastructure that would help deal with some of those other ongoing, more structural issues. Unfortunately, the global response has not been terrific in this sense, and that's what we're here to address.
We're going to get into that, as you said. To begin our conversation, I wanted to share a map from the Our World in Data website showing the share of people who received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine as of February 23rd, 2022. You can see how the countries shaded in dark green, such as Canada, the U.S., Western Europe, Australia, Brazil, and China, most of their populations have received at least one dose, while most of Africa is shaded in light colors, indicating their populations have yet to receive their first dose. The site also says only 12% of people in low-income countries have received at least one dose. Rowena, when you look at that map, what jumps out at you?
Well, absolutely. We are still dealing with a vaccine inequity. And as you might know, actually, February 24th is an interesting day. It's the first, it actually is the first year anniversary of when COVAX delivered its first round of doses to Ghana in Africa. And the idea behind COVAX was to ensure that there was vaccine equity and that, it didn't matter where you were in the world, you would still have access to the COVID-19 vaccine. We know, and we can see very plainly with that map, that unfortunately that hasn't happened. There has been some gains. The COVAX facility, of which UNICEF is a key delivery partner, has delivered up to 1 billion vaccines to date. However, 80% of the world's COVID-19 vaccine supply that was available last year went to G20 countries. And hence, we are in the situation where we are now, where only about 10% of people in low-income countries have even received a first dose. And some of the contexts in which we are needing to deliver vaccines are some of the most difficult. And in addition to vaccines, we're not seeing the delivery of rapid tests and PPE and all the other things that are really needed to stop the pandemic.
Catherine, Rowena mentioned COVAX, which is the global initiative aimed at equitable vaccine distribution. The anniversary was this past Thursday. What's the connection between vaccine equity and reducing the spread of COVID-19?
I think what we know is this is a global pandemic of an infectious disease, and that no one in the world is really going to be safe until all global citizens have had the opportunity to be vaccinated. We know that variants will continue to emerge as long as COVID is circulating freely, and that's what's happening in many parts of the world. And I think it creates a real false sense of security for those of us who have had the privilege to be vaccinated. And, we're seeing that in Canada, the sentiment that the pandemic is over. And I think that's really not true for many reasons. And the longer that we leave this issue of vaccine equity on the table without resolving it, the more variants we're going to see, the longer this pandemic is going to drag on. And of course, the most distressing part is the loss of life that will continue in the global south that could be prevented through vaccination.
You mentioned that, here in Ontario, it feels as if the pandemic is over. And I think for a lot of the pandemic, it seems as if each country was concerned with taking care of its own. How then do we change that now when some of us do feel like it is over?
I think that's why conversations like this are so important, is to remind people that we do live in a globe where there's different situations for different people, and that we cannot have the hubris to think that we're done with this when we haven't done our job in terms of creating equity for other global citizens. So I think keeping that awareness front and center for our population, keeping the pressure on our government to deliver on the promises they've made for vaccine delivery in the global south, keeping this conversation top of mind, I think is really critical.
What would you say is the percentage of the world's population that would need to be vaccinated in order to make a difference?
Well, I think ideally we want to see as many people vaccinated as possible. I think we know from that herd immunity perspective with the new variants that we're seeing that number is probably as high as 85 or 90%. Now, of course, some people will have immunity from having been infected themselves. So at this point, I think it's hard to nail down an exact number. But what's very clear is the vaccines are incredibly effective in terms of preventing severe disease and hospitalization. And there's many people in the global south that are losing their lives because of lack of access to vaccination. So the more people that can be vaccinated, the better. The sooner we can achieve that, the more lives that we'll save.
And Rowena, you mentioned that UNICEF is a partner with COVAX, and you mentioned what your organization has done. Is there enough supply to meet the demand?
Well, yes, interestingly enough, there was definitely supply issues last year. So not surprisingly enough, to anybody who's listening to this, high-income countries got the bulk of the supply, and other countries, low and middle-income countries, had a harder time getting their hands on supply. But now vaccine production has ramped up, and in addition, through the generosity of many countries who have excess vaccine supply, the supply issue doesn't seem to be the problem. What is the problem is, I guess, to a certain extent, when the supply arrives. So in many cases, it comes on an ad hoc basis, especially when it comes to donations. So we very much appreciate all the dose donations, but we need them to come at a time that we can plan, that countries are able to ramp up, that they have the time to put forth a mass vaccination effort, similar to what we needed to do here in Canada. And so they have to come with a shelf life of at least 10 weeks. We were getting sometimes vaccines that only had a shelf life of 2 weeks. So obviously very hard to roll that out. But I would also echo that, for example, rapid tests, which are so important in terms of identifying outbreaks and isolating individuals so that there isn't that unfettered ongoing rapid spread. Again, those are big issues. We don't have enough access in low-income countries to those tools either. And high-income countries actually use rapid tests 80 times more than low-income countries. So it's we just have to look at the issue in a much more holistic way as well.
Stuart, I can only imagine if you are living in a low-income country and you're relying on donations from high-income countries. Is that the way that we should do it?
No, it's not ideal. The whole notion that we donate, these people in the developing world want to be vaccinated as much as we do. They deserve to have access the way that we do. We started out in such a promising approach to this with COVAX, and our own government, an early investor and supporter of the COVAX and the ACT Accelerator, which is dedicated, as Catherine mentioned, to equity. The way the pandemic should have been responded to is that the most vulnerable people in all countries gain first access to vaccines. That was what the intention was. First responders and the most vulnerable, immune compromised people in the developing world can't socially isolate the way that we do here. They don't have economies that can support them living and working at home. And yet even though we invested early in COVAX and ACT Accelerator, what we did was we procured most of the supply. As Rowena said, it's really just another example of structural inequality and even racism. And that makes people really uncomfortable to talk about that. But this is a pattern of behavior of how the global North and the South integrate. They're not waiting for us to give them things. They have the expertise to develop vaccines and manufacture them in their own countries. If we could just twist the arms of the pharmaceutical companies to recognize the value of people over profit. I mean, ultimately, it seems a little unfair that children in Canada, and I know we all care about our children, but why is a 5-year-old in a wealthy middle-class family in Canada getting vaccinated before an HIV survivor or an AIDS grandmother or a frontline worker in Africa? We had enough surplus vaccines in this country last year beyond what we needed to vaccinate every frontline health worker in Africa, and we didn't convert or share back or redirect those doses. So, and I just want to add one other thing to what you said, to what Catherine said, that this is, the problem right now is not technology, it's not knowledge, it's focus. And we had a tantalizing taste of freedom last summer, but then ironically, a variant emerged, as many people predicted in November, Omicron. And we had the experience of going back into lockdown and learning that, okay, maybe it's true that even though we're highly vaccinated here, we're not going to escape this until everyone does. But now, once again, the urgency seems to be receding. We're opening up. We're letting go of our measures to protect us. Social pressure is on the government to release, to let us get back to normal. But the fact is, it's not going to work until we deal with this problem and enable developing countries to manufacture their own vaccines and invest in COVAX. We are at high risk of another variant coming. And it's particularly precarious now because it will be more difficult for our governments to put in place measures to protect us once they've taken them all down, not to mention the huge economic cost of going back into lockdown or other measures to support our economies in a new variant. So we're in a particularly perilous time.
You brought up some comments that some issues that I want to come back to, but you mentioned pharmaceutical companies. 6 African countries, that's Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia, are set to receive the technology to produce mRNA vaccines. How willing have pharmaceutical companies been to share the technology necessary to produce COVID-19 vaccines, Stuart?
Well, I know Catherine probably has a strong opinion on this too, but from our perspective, it's extremely frustrating to see, once again, the profit versus people model. And our own countries and our own governments have been reluctant to push pharmaceutical manufacturers in this direction about releasing or temporarily waiving intellectual property rights to meet this urgent global unprecedented need when we are negotiating with these companies to provide supplies for our own domestic populations. So, I mean, the 6-hub experiment or, investment that the World Health Organization is working on is really critical. And it doesn't seem that the main mRNA vaccine manufacturers are particularly keen on engaging with that. That's something where we need to continue to keep pressure on our governments to press the pharmaceutical companies and work within those mechanisms to make sure that that the restrictions are loosened, frankly.
Catherine, is it a positive step that 6 countries have received this technology to produce their own vaccines?
I think it's a critical step. As we're hearing, we need countries to be able to have that domestic production or regional production so that they can prioritize their citizens. As I think what's clear is the rest of the world to this point has failed in that delivery. So I think the sharing of that technology, the ability for regional production of vaccines to create the predictability that's so critical for delivery is a very important next step. And I think, it's unfortunate it hasn't happened till now. But at least on a go-forward basis, we're going to see that ability. And I think that will be very important in terms of the next few months.
Catherine, how would you rate the Canadian government's contributions to global vaccine equity?
Well, I think what we've seen right now is, Canada has made good on part of its promise, but certainly not all of it. They, mid-February, they delivered, I think it was 13.5 million doses to COVAX. They've promised over 200 million doses by the end of this year. So we have a long ways to go to make good on that promise. And I think, again, as we've heard from the other guests, it's not just about numbers of vaccines, it's also about timing. There needs to be predictability. Other countries need to be able to plan for their delivery. So we need to do not only just getting the vaccines there, but getting them there in a reliable way. So I think Canada still has a lot of work to do to make good on their promise.
Rowena, it's one thing to have access to these vaccines, but we've seen anti-vaccination sentiment and vaccine hesitancy in North America. Is that also happening in developing countries?
Well, absolutely. I mean, anytime you want to be able to vaccinate a lot of people on a very quick basis, there is going to be vaccine hesitancy as the information rolls out. And we know with the COVID-19 vaccines, they're incredibly new, and there has been a lot of misinformation that has been shared. So people in low-income countries, they're no different than people here in Canada, and they need the proper information and the proper time to process and make the right decision for them and their families. UNICEF is working with partners on the ground in all of the contexts that we talked about in low and middle-income countries to really work to understand where there might be vaccine hesitancy and to work to deal in those specific areas. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We're working with partners like One in some of the countries that we serve, and it really is about ensuring that healthcare workers have the capacity and the training, community leaders are engaged so that populations and communities are hearing the information from people they already trust. And then there is that whole idea of ensuring that we're getting to people in the most remote settings. So not everyone has the ability to share information as we do here in Canada. And we have to remember that in some contexts, they have other issues that are very pressing. There's not a huge digital infrastructure to share information. Many countries are in the middle of conflict, crisis. There's malnutrition crises going on. Other epidemics are happening when it comes to measles, et cetera. So there's healthcare infrastructure that doesn't exist that we enjoy here in Canada. So it really is, again, going to these countries with the ability to have adequate resources to support them in the way they need to be supported and ensuring that vaccines become vaccinations.
Before we started taping, I shared that in Uganda, where I'm from, people have been kind of duped. People have been selling fake vaccines. When the lockdowns happened, and a lot of people, it's like if you don't work that day, you don't eat. And as we know, the data shows that there are many people around the world who haven't even received one dose. It's one thing to procure the vaccines, but how do you convince people to get vaccinated if they know that they've been kind of last on the list and so far they haven't gotten COVID? Stuart?
That's a really good point. I'm glad you raised that because, people often use the perception of additional hesitancy in the developing world as an excuse to not take action. It's a problem that we in the global north have largely created through other programs, through generations. These countries have been given the last access to vaccines and treatments of all kinds. They've been told what to do by governments rather than being engaged as partners. This stuff has come from outside the continent rather than drawing on the enormous technical and social expertise of these countries. So it's an excuse that's not particularly valid, and it can be addressed by more direct action and building infrastructure and supporting local organizations and governments to be more engaged in supplying their own needs, as is the case with most poverty reduction strategies. The side-on effect of all of this, of doing this properly, once again, is that if we get this right and we partner with the developing world and we help them build infrastructure and we create resilience through their vaccination programs, this will prepare us all for the next pandemic and for other global health crises. The organizations that are involved in COVAX and the ACT Accelerator are all leading organizations that have been involved in mass vaccination campaigns in the developing world already. There's a lot of expertise already there. It just needs to be harnessed and enabled and supported. And that's largely through funding, but also through the other things that the other guests have mentioned, such as PPE and refrigeration, and some of that support, political support. But it means our leaders here have to start thinking beyond our own borders and put the lives of other people as highly on the pedestal as our own.
Well, speaking of our borders, Catherine, when Omicron hit, there was a push for people to get their booster shots. Right now in Ontario, if you're older than 12, you can get a booster shot. Was that a mistake given how unvaccinated so much of the world continues to be?
I think that's a really important question. And I think it weighs on the minds of some people who have in Canada chosen to receive their third booster. Am I making this decision for myself at the expense of someone else? And I think that would have been true several months ago when vaccine production wasn't necessarily where it needed to be globally. So we were taking our share of vaccines at the expense of other countries. We're now at a place where the amount of vaccines that are being produced monthly are adequate to meet the needs of boosting our population while simultaneously providing vaccines to the global south. The issue is how they're being distributed, how they're being procured, and how we're actually sharing the vaccines that are available around the world. So I think we're in a fortunate position now that we don't necessarily need to be making the choice between those things, but what we do need to be doing is prioritizing getting the vaccines that are available to the countries that need them.
And Rowena, when we talk about booster shots, how low-income countries even had that option?
Well, as I mentioned, only about 10% of people in low-income countries have even had their first shot. But I just wanted to echo what the other guests have said, is that we can't end this pandemic one country at a time. That is absolutely impossible. We saw with the rise of Omicron that where there is no protection or a lack of protection in other parts of the country, there is mutation of the virus, and it will come back to us, and all of the little short-lived freedoms we might enjoy right now, we'll lose them. And so we really need to look at this much more holistically. We need to prioritize helping the rest of the world get vaccinated and have the other tools in the toolbox available to them. And it isn't charitable. I guess we're using the word donation of doses. But it is not a charitable act. It really is an investment in all of our futures. So, where there is actually, you can go beyond the ethical and the moral imperative to do this, which there absolutely is one. But there's actually a self-interest as well, and that countries need to look at the fact that this will not end for any of us unless it ends for all of us. And so let's prioritize this. We all want to get out of the pandemic. We all want everything to go back. We as the leading organization, when it comes to children around the world, we are seeing what is happening to children around the world. Many schools remain closed. The motivations to get our population booster shots and keep schools open and open businesses, that is no different for people in low-income countries. And what is happening is that there are millions of children that might never go to school, that are being forced into child labor, child marriage. So the impact and the implications of inaction on when it comes to vaccinating the world and fighting the pandemic together will have forward impact on all of us. So like I said, it's really important that we start to prioritize the world and the global efforts and not just try and end this pandemic country by country.
Catherine, I have a big question to ask. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead, Stuart.
I really want to switch gears a little bit to try and reach the audience, because I think implied in all of this discussion is a sense of being passive. We waited for our government to procure doses. We wondered whether we should get a third dose and whether that was responsible. And I think, as Catherine mentioned, we were each thinking like, well, it's here, it's available, and it will protect me. I should do this. Some kind of resignation there. But I think now is a time where we need to call for people to be more actively engaged. Maybe, instead of talking about blaming and shaming and looking at the past and how things were done, but recognizing that it wasn't the best rollout that ever, there's a role for the individual now, Canadian, in this. And the passive role is like recognize where we are in our relatively good position and how fortunate we are to have had access to first, second, and third doses. But we want people to contact their members of parliament to urge them to get behind this idea of vaccine equity, to make sure that people who don't have a voice have equal access to tests, treatments, and vaccines. The only way our politicians are going to make this a priority, particularly when Omicron is receding and governments are opening up, and we see other things happening in the world that are going to obscure the debate, such as the recent action in Ukraine, we need to keep the political pressure and support on our government to move decisively in this direction. Otherwise, we risk it fading away, and then we're all at greater risk of a new variant and further pandemic. It just will keep going.
And Catherine, I have about a minute left, and I have a big question. I'm trying to surmise everything that you all three said, because with the booster shots, we know that, well, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the efficacy wanes after a certain period of time. If we're debating whether or not we should be getting a fourth booster, while keeping in mind, Rowena mentioned the self-interest that we need to think globally. Each country, I don't know, how do you pivot from worrying about your own population, but if you don't expend your self-interest outside to the global community, there is that real concern that another variant will come and destroy the efforts of those countries. So how does anyone balance all those things in a way while we try to promote this idea of vaccine equity?
I think that's a really important question, and I think there's several aspects to the answer. One is what our expectation of vaccines are. So when we're talking about waning effectiveness, what we're really meaning is the ability of the vaccine to prevent you from being infected from COVID. And that has changed with new variants. But what hasn't changed is the effectiveness of the vaccine in terms of preventing hospitalization and severe disease, which is the most important outcome. And it's not clear that additional vaccines are necessary to maintain that protection. So I think we need to perhaps adjust what our expectation of the vaccines are, and that will be critical. And I absolutely agree. I think the next priority, and what should have been the priority all along, is the importance of getting as many people around the world vaccinated with that primary series. That is critical. That has to happen. We've waited long enough. We need to make that our next priority. So I think we need to step back from worrying about these small details that we worry about here because of the privilege we have, and really getting that global picture of until we have everybody safe, no one is safe. And as Canadians, we have to keep our voices strong to government in terms of making this a priority.
We'll leave it there. Thank you to the three of you. I know your schedules are so busy. We really do appreciate all the work that you've been doing throughout this. Thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nam.
If you can see it, you can be it, meaning role models matter. Ashley Akwosa is TVO's diversity and inclusion reporter, and she's been writing a profile of Black women finding the inspiration to run for political office. And she joins us now from the provincial capital for more. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Jan. How are you?
Not too bad. So how important is it to have a relatable role model inspiring the way?
You know, I spoke to Dr. Jean Augustine, who told me that when she was first asked to enter politics, and she was asked a lot by a lot of people, she was very hesitant for multiple reasons. Politics didn't really seem like a desirable place for, for Black women at the time. And there weren't really a lot of Black women in politics. So, Dr. Augustine, who was active in the community before she even became an elected official, told me that community members were even telling her, why would you run? Do you see anyone that looks like you there? So her experience was interesting because I think that lack of representation could have influenced her not to run. Thank goodness it didn't. But also for voters, that lack of representation was them saying, well, if we don't have people that look like us there, maybe the issues that are important to us are not being, heard or represented.
Now, in your reporting, you spoke about a couple of women who were cited as role models, including Jean Augustine, of course, that we saw a photo there, an archival photo there. What is sort of the conversation about Jean Augustine and her inspiration to women who are looking to get into politics?
Yeah, I think that almost everyone that I spoke to referenced her as an inspiration to them. The story starts with Amber Morley, who saw Jean Augustine serving as an MP for, Etobicoke Lakeshore in Toronto. That's Amber's own district when she was much younger. Years later, Amber would run for city councillor to represent Etobicoke Lakeshore. And I will say that Amber's journey to politics is entirely her own, and it's kind of born out of her own experience advocating for youth services in her community for a number of years. But I do know that impact of seeing another woman in office and feeling validated by that, and knowing that because they're there, you also can do that too. And that's really the experience a lot of women told me they had because they had seen Dr. Augustine.
All right, so I want to talk about another trailblazer, Zane Akande. This is a photo of her when she was in politics from 1990 to 1994. What was her political experience like?
Yeah, I learned a lot about her political experience from interviews she'd given, one in particular that she did with Steve Paikin, where she talked about her disappointment with how things turned out in the legislature. She was the first Black woman to be elected as MP in Ontario. And at the time, it was just her and Alvin Curling who were the only Black members of the Ontario legislature. And she talked openly about the preoccupation the media and her colleagues had with her in terms of people making comments about her car, her dressing, things that had absolutely nothing to do with the political work that she was trying to do. And I think that being one of the only Black women in this space, or the only Black woman in this space, comes with a heightened visibility that can be distracting. So you have people who are putting their opinions on who they think you should be, on you. In the interview with Steve Paikin, Zane Akande actually spoke about how prepared she was. She had read everything that needed to be read. She was there ready to do the work. And the focus of the conversations that people were having around her weren't really what she thought they would be.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the balance there of risk and reward here. Why is it important for Black women to pursue political positions?
Yeah, I think that, it's important to have Black women in many spaces, as they can be. But what I did hear from a lot of Black women that were in office is, they're bringing their entire selves, they're bringing their lived experiences, their insight to the decisions that they're making about policy. And Lauren May Lindo, who's also part of the Ontario NDP Black Caucus, told me that as a result of the caucus, there's really a space for her to be addressing anti-Black racism as part of what she does. So they're thinking about how policies will affect racialized communities when it comes from everything to housing, healthcare, and education. Councillor Kemia Kapo, who's a city councillor in Peterborough, told me that, politicians are obviously thinking a lot about how will decisions affect the budget, but it was really important for her to think about the social impact of decisions that politicians are making. So yeah, I think that full experience that Black women do bring is really, really important.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of being not only Black, but also a woman. Jill Andrew, the MPP for Toronto St. Paul, you talked to her, and she brought up the term misogynoir. Help me sort of understand that. What does she mean by that?
Yeah, a misogynoir is a term that was coined by an African-American scholar named Moya Bailey, and it's been described as really a combination of racism and misogyny. Women face misogyny, but it usually can be different for Black women because you're experiencing racism as well. And misogynoir can be reflected in the stereotypes about Black women that have persisted for so long. For example, a Black woman being assertive can be characterized as being an angry Black woman, or there's the expectation that Black women can endure almost dehumanizing physical and emotional experiences, but are praised as strong or seen as being able to handle that because they are the strong Black women. So those are just a few of the ways in which your race and gender can really intersect and shape your experience.
Now, it's one thing to run for office. In most situations, a lot of these candidates are recruited, and there's a whole other experience once you finally get there. You did talk to some of the women about sort of what that actual work atmosphere was like. What did they have to say?
Yeah, Lauren May Lindo talked about, looking at the Speaker's chair in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, which dates from about 1874, but knowing that Black people were enslaved from 1600 to 1834, and to be sitting in that space as an elected official, there are a lot of emotions associated with that. And I think that a lot of the Black women that I spoke to also recognized that they had a responsibility to represent a community, which is a really, really hard job. Just the Black community in Ontario in itself is incredibly diverse. And I think that that's a large burden. So for a lot of the women that I spoke to, being the first or one of the first in those spaces were titles that they carried with a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of reverence.
Now, we know when we have candidates that are diverse, they tap into communities that are diverse as well. How do voters respond to Black women candidates?
Yeah, in the story, I kind of feature an example where it's a little bit different. We have Kristen Murray, who was running for city councilor in Timmins in 2018. And at the time, she lived in Timmins for a while. Timmins, as we know, has a much smaller Black population than Toronto, for example. And I think that she was worried that her race would really play a factor, but it wasn't. She was elected, and I think she said it was because people connected with her, because maybe they were looking for something new, someone new to represent them. And I did speak to experts who are saying that people are more likely to vote along their, political party lines or like along their values. So being a Black woman, a Black woman running for office doesn't make her less likely to win because she's Black.
Now, you had mentioned Laura May Lindo, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of the way that the political sphere can be made to be more equitable. And what did she have to share with you about that?
She talked about, how seeing her, because she does a lot of work with high school students who are kind of, after seeing who she is and seeing her in politics, are interested in kind of pursuing that path also. So I think that was something she referenced, being Black and then being in the community and showing people that, because I'm here, you can be here also. But I also spoke to experts like Velma Morgan, who work with Operation Black Vote Canada, and she talked a little bit about the roadblocks, like what's needed to kind of remove these roadblocks so that there are more Black women in politics. Things like funding, a lot of candidates are not coming from legacy families or don't have, large political funding. So she talked about how parties really need to do a lot to make sure that when Black women are entering, the race, like they're well funded, they're well supported so that they feel like they belong here and they can do this work.
Ashley, really great stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan.
The agenda this week learned how cell phones can become cyber weapons, heard about the joys and challenges of being Black and queer, assessed racism in the wellness industry. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the economic factors contributing to populism.
The original title of our book was Defeating Populism when we first started thinking about it. But it became very clear as we maybe perhaps started to empathize and sympathize with the populist complaint around economic unfairness. Again, that Americans live over a trapdoor that can be sprung by a number of different things that we kind of take for granted that you're going to be taken care of in Canada. We changed the title with the advice of our editor in the UK with Polity Books of Reclaiming Populism. And remember that the underlying thesis of the book is how to win back disenchanted voters, how to give mainstream politicians the language and the tools to bring back people who feel marginalized, who feel that there's a clique, as Armin says, that basically write the rules for them that they have no part and they don't benefit from. So what we're arguing, particularly in chapters 4 and 5, is there's a number of very powerful tools that mainstream politicians can use if they take the claims of populist voters, disenchanted voters seriously, that you can reclaim the populist vote and bring it back to create a more inclusive, pluralist, pro-democratic country.
Understood. Miles, in some respects, I hate to bring the convoy back into this thing because there are so many different agendas going on in different locations that it's hard to know. But let's just say, I mean, surely Irene is correct. Part of this is, don't tell me what to do with my body. I'll on the whole vaccine issue. But part of it surely is there are a number of people who feel as if the economy has moved right along and right past them, and that the social mobility that they once thought was part of the Canadian dream is no longer there. That's certainly some people's agenda in the convoy. We've heard it. We've heard it from a number of people who've lost their jobs and who think that the Canadian dream is not part of their particular reality anymore. And I guess the question is, if they're right, What went wrong?
If they're right, what went wrong? To some degree, they are right. Statistics Canada, for example, has shown that somewhere around 50% of children are doing better than their parents. If they're right, what went wrong? Two things. One, as Paul alluded to, it's the nature of growth. What happened is, as we grabbed onto this globalism agenda, this neoliberal agenda in the 80s and 90s, opening up the economy, an economy that was hit with major changes in the way we work, with the power of computing. What went wrong is some people had to compete head on with the computer. If you do routine jobs, like think of your stereotypical factory worker who would have a piece of machinery move across him and he would weld a joint. Well, robots do that now. Think of middle managers whose major job was to process information, to move it from the shop floor to upper management. Well, Excel spreadsheets can do that now. So people who were doing routine jobs went head to head in competition with the computer, and they lost out. They lost out in status, and that impacted their identity as well. One of the things that I would pair with this book is a recent book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit.
Oh, we had him on this program talking about that book. It's a great one.
That's right. And so what he also points out, as Paul has just said, the thing about inequality, it engenders entitlement amongst those at the top. It fosters shame amongst those at the bottom, and it creates insecurity for everybody in the middle. So this gets wrapped up with identity as well. And this is where I sort of disagree with Paul. If you just sort of move into a prescription of more social mobility, it depends upon how identity politics gets layered onto that. You talked about that famous quote of Hillary Clinton's. What went wrong is we didn't value the work that people now do in any way. We didn't recognize their dignity. What could be worse for a lot of males who did work that was more routine, whose identity was wrapped up with being a provider, than to have a highly educated urban woman tell them that they're deplorable? And so then that opens up a whole different identity politics. Two things went wrong. We didn't pay enough attention to people who can't get an education. We kept telling them, get more education. And if they can't, then they're perceived as losers. So it was the economy mixing up with a type of rhetoric that engendered entitlement, created shame, fostered insecurity.
What we need to be doing is talking about how we make every job a good job in an era of population aging. You know, populism in an era of population aging could be leading to making more jobs better jobs, could be leading to making the best benefits are portable benefits. As we've learned with our healthcare system, we've got a real issue on understanding how the social infrastructure we offer one another becomes the platform on which we build a more inclusive economy where more people are benefiting from growth because they're getting something back from it. They're not just contributing to higher productivity and more profits. They're actually seeing quality of life improving, whether it's through wages or through services that they can access, high quality service they can access at low cost. For example, early learning and childcare, which is a huge breakthrough, but the first one in a generation, 2 generations.
When you hack into a device using Pegasus, which is probably the most sophisticated mercenary spyware technology in the world today, first of all, it leaves no trace. This particular version of Pegasus involved no interaction on the part of the target. They simply commandeered the device silently, so the target wouldn't be aware that there's somebody else, a spy in their pocket, if you will. Once you're inside that device, you can do virtually anything and more, really, than a user can do. So that means you can read every email, every text message, even those that are end-to-end encrypted. You can turn on the camera. You can turn on the audio capture, effectively turning that device into a bug. You could also plant falsely incriminating information if you so desire. I'm not saying that happened in this case, but the prospect is certainly there. So there's a whole range of things that can be done. Speaking to the question you asked, one of the victims, a prominent senator who was leading the opposition in the 2019 elections and whose phone we determined was hacked multiple times with Pegasus, his confidential information was actually broadcast out of context over Polish state media to try to paint a picture of him that was unflattering and perhaps corrupt. So that speaks to what you're asking here. What are the possibilities? Well, you can certainly spy on someone, engage in espionage, but you can also gather information, taint it in various ways, leak it, broadcast it out of context to falsely incriminate somebody.
Well, you are painting a picture of something that I have seen described as the most powerful cyber weapon in the world. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yes, absolutely. That was an analysis done by Google's Project Zero team. This is like their high-tech threat intelligence team. They did a breakdown of Pegasus based on actually a disclosure that the Citizen Lab made. We captured Pegasus in the wild last year and disclosed it to Apple. Google Project Zero did a breakdown of it, and they said this is by far the most sophisticated piece of surveillance technology that they had ever seen.
Now, Pegasus is that sort of mythical horse with wings. Why do they call this thing Pegasus?
I don't know. That's some branding exercise by the company itself. I have no idea. All I can say is this is very powerful technology sold by a very lucrative company, makes a lot of money, a lot of revenue from this type of sale to government clients who have a insatiable appetite. I mean, you can imagine, just think about how I described this type of technology. If you put yourself in the position of a government security agency, how addictive that would be once you start, spying on someone, gathering information. You want to do more of it. And this surveillance technology is sold on a license basis. So how many victims do you want to hack? Well, it'll cost you X dollars.
Now, your Citizen Lab has initiated something called the Pegasus Project. What's that all about?
The Pegasus Project is a consortium of journalists and NGOs, especially Amnesty International, that came together to work on investigating abuses of Pegasus spyware. Actually, the Citizen Lab's role in that particular project is more of a supportive one. We did a peer review of some of their methodology and the forensic analysis that they did. So we're not behind it, if you will. Although I will say that the Citizen Lab actually did the very first public evidence-based report on NSO Group back in 2016. We really kicked off investigations into NSO Group and have done extensive reporting ever since.
We actually sought to understand that very dynamic, like what is the urban or city experience compared to the rural experience or the outer city experience. And we found that there aren't a lot of programs for Black LGBT youth, and maybe those programs that are in their local neighborhoods, they prefer not to access, because roughly 50% of the respondents in our community needs assessment shared that they commuted to Toronto for programming, like LGBTQ programming. And I think a lot of that has to do with safety, a lot of that has to do with options, as well as connections, the type of programs that's being run in the city. Unfortunately, most programs are in the downtown core. It's I don't even live in downtown Toronto, but it's in the downtown core. So for individuals who live outside the city, that does create an additional task, I guess, in terms of having to commute maybe an hour or 2 hours to get to a program. But yeah, I think there are like service deserts, depending on where you are in the country.
And Samantha, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about the workplace, and I imagine that experiences are very different for different generations. How do the challenges of young Black and queer folks differ from members of the community who might be older?
Yeah, so I think the issues for younger Black queer folks that I've encountered thus far are things like doxing. Folks that have accessed our services, for instance, work in sex work, right? And so the issues may be different, but I think that they also are similar in the sense that the core issue or the crux of the issue also more often than not has to deal with harassment, discrimination, ableism, transphobia. And so while there may be different needs between generations, I think the crux of the issue remains the same. And so I'm fortunate to be able to support folks regardless of their age.
You know, one of the things that I love about social media is the fact that you can see content that otherwise you might never see before. Last week, I saw a video of these two older women who were finally getting married, and because they were, for most of their life, their relationship was a secret. Kamali, you know, are there issues older generations face that might be different from those of who are in the younger generation?
Absolutely. I think we should be concerned around LGBTQI plus persons of color who are getting older. You know, I came of age a generation after those who were primarily affected by the HIV epidemic, and though that population continues to do so. And we know that LGBTQI plus seniors face issues of isolation, homelessness, and we need to be concerned about ensuring that older LGBTQI plus persons are taken care of as well. And I also just want to go back to a comment you made to my colleague Tatiana around services in the LGBTQI plus community and downtown Toronto. I think we really have to point out, or at least I want to point out, that for many, Church Street is not a safe place for people of color. And it's not just because of services downtown, but it is because around racism that exists within the LGBTQI plus community. So that needs to be pointed out, and the lack of access to services for people that makes them coming downtown is real. And what that means is, unfortunately, even though you know, it's great to see rainbow flags down in Church Street and the downtown core, what it also means is that people who do not feel safe getting access to services are sometimes living in communities that are not safe for them.
This tension plays out around who profits, who benefits, who gets to call themselves a leader, an expert, a guru, and then this pushback around the calling in and the desire to recognize and decolonize practices that are often from cultures of origin or co-opted by people who aren't originally from that culture of origin. And this like fragility and defensiveness of, oh, but this really, I'm really good at this and it really serves me and it's really serving the community that I've created. So this tension around these beautiful practices that really do serve to individual and collective well-being, but who benefits from what leader, where do the profits flow, this sort of thing.
We're going to get into some of the things that you brought up. The wellness industry is a billion-dollar industry. Katie, what sectors fall under the wellness economy umbrella?
Yeah, well, I really believe in the 7 prongs of wellness. And so spiritual, physical, mental, intellectual, all of these sectors fall under that economy, including, I think I mentioned social and occupational. So anything that involves someone's well-being, their job, their livelihood, their health and wellness, that falls under the wellness economy.
And do we know how much that economy is worth?
There's lots of projections and it changes every single day, but as per Forbes in 2019, they did project that by the end of 2022, it would be worth more than $77 billion.
That's a lot of money. Rebecca, who does this leave behind?
Going back to what Robin had touched on earlier, you know, and that whole entire piece around reclaiming practices that are indigenous or practices that come and stem from racialized communities. For the most part, when we think about wellness, I don't know about you, Nam, but for a very long time, I was the only person of color, the only Black woman. in my yoga practices and in yoga studios and spaces and a lot of wellness spaces beyond just yoga. And so for me, when I look at it, it's typically and historically racialized people and other people who occupy spaces of marginality that are excluded from wellness spaces as well as wellness practices. So it's not just the actual space, but then the idea of being able to see themselves reflected back in practice too as well, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a physical space to be able to embody that. But what ends up happening is that people also then are just excluded from all practices and all facets of what that wellness, all facets of what wellness looks like and can be, or how it's processed at an individual and a collective community level too as well.
Rebecca, you mentioned that you would be taking yoga classes and you were the only person that looked like you. Did you feel like you didn't belong, or did you feel, were you not welcomed by the people in that space?
For a very long time, I was the only woman of color, the only Black person. I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years. And for a large part of that time, that's just how I was felt. I was felt like I wasn't welcomed. I've, been in spaces where people have, I've come into the space and people have moved their mats.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, February 25th, 2022. Monday, there are many recommendations to deal with the housing affordability gap. Are any of them politically feasible? We'll explore that. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.